When I was growing up, I don't think that the idea of authority was really a problem. I didn't feel it within my family. I didn't feel, you might say, dominated or threatened by any of the members of my family. And when I went to school, there was authority and teachers were allowed to hit you if they wanted to. But generally that didn't happen to me, just a couple of times. And school for me was something I went through but really didn't value at all. I didn't feel I was valued at school, and I didn't value anything about school whatsoever. And I think because I was quite independent at home within the family, when I went to school I retained that independence and you might say confidence and security within myself. So I knew that I wasn't really dependent on the school, and it was simply, as I say, something you went through. It's like if you went from Oxford to London on the train or the coach, you would just accept the conditions on the coach and on the train just so you can get to London. And it was nothing more than that for me. It was just something I put up with, and I knew that was the fact that my brother and sister went through, and my friends were there, and I didn't come out of school at the end of it feeling that I was under the, you might say, influence of authority. And because we weren't religious or political, I don't think the word authority would have meant much to me. The feeling that someone was dominating my life or controlling my life or telling me what to do. And then when I went to university, I was free to choose whatever course I wanted. And I didn't follow through the university program. And I think the first time I felt the presence of authority in my life was when I became spiritual. So when I became spiritual at the age of 23, due to an experience which I equated, once I read the text, with enlightenment or self-awareness, I then came under the influence and authority of the sacred texts. So what people said in the past about their spiritual experiences really, you might say, dominated me probably most of my life. Even though I had my own experiences, I didn't feel that those experiences gave me objectivity. That means in the text, people were saying that they had gone to a transcendental dimension, mystically speaking, and I knew that I hadn't left my body and gone to this transcendental dimension, so that in a way that became an authority. So you could say, on a very basic level, I allowed someone else to rule it over me, as it were. So I'm allowing another human being, even though they're dead, to operate in my life as though they know something I don't. They've experienced something I haven't. And naturally, you recognize the fact that you haven't experienced what they have. And so within the spiritual tradition, within the sacred text, you're always measuring your experience against others in the past. So I came under the influence of Krishnamurti, and then that moved on to Carl Jung. And when I finally did my major work, which I finished a few years ago, I felt I liberated myself from Jung's influence. But the thing about Jung is that he focused on the psyche, and he wasn't really concerned with objectivity in the sense of a spiritual dimension, but really that our consciousness and our thought are related to dreams and visions and the psyche, and we're in the psyche anyway. So he didn't have a notion of transcendence beyond the psyche, whereas I felt my original experience of self-awareness, enlightenment, was an experience that was spiritual and concerned the mind, and in the sense of the one mind rather than the psyche. So in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the one mind would have been equated with transcendental wisdom, and Jung wasn't really concerned with that aspect of reality. So we tend to internalize an authority, and in a sense we're living up to that authority. And that happens in any field of life. You know, within the family you could live up to your brother or sister or mother and father. In college you study different subjects, and each subject has various authorities in art and music, philosophy, history, and it's inevitable that you come under the influence of an authority. And the word authority is related to author. So the author, you could say, is the originator of what they write. And to be an author is to be authentic, to be genuine. So in that sense, the authority can be genuine and authentic. So when I had my first experience of spiritual awareness, that was a fact of my experience, and I was confident in its authenticity. So in a way, I was empowered with a kind of authority in that I knew about that experience. So I knew that others had experienced that. So at least I knew that I was integral to the spiritual tradition, that my experience is equated with other people's experience. And that happened throughout my life, where I could always measure and align my experiences to other people and to the sacred text, and develop or deepen a sense of myself. And today, I wouldn't consider myself to have achieved the level of authority, which means if I did achieve transcendental wisdom, then the term authority would no longer apply in the sense that I'm measuring up to someone else, or I'm seeking an experience which is, in a sense, ultimate. However, if I did experience transcendental wisdom, then that authentic experience would make me an authoritative person. So I would have a kind of authority in that I knew what I was talking about if I talked about some objective spiritual experience, whereas now I know that I would be deceiving people if I went around thinking and saying that I had experienced something ultimate. I think also we're conditioned to think of authority as a sense of being overpowered by something, like the idea of God, or any kind of deity or figure like Buddha or Christ. You know, that there's a sense of they dominate the historical landscape. So if we think of the past, we think of tradition, and we think of the world we live in, it's built on the past, it's built on tradition. So those figures are like giants on our horizon, so we project them into the future as, you might say, yardsticks to measure our understanding, to measure our capacity, to measure our comprehension of life. And also another aspect of authority, which you could find in the family, in the school, and in the workplace, and in politics, and religion, and various other things, is a sense of fear. You know, the fear of doing something wrong. And so the idea of the fear of doing something wrong is that somebody sets the standards by which to live. And if you do something wrong, you're supposed to feel guilty. I would say in my psychological vocabulary, I don't think guilt has played very much, hasn't really been integral to my way of looking at life. I don't know if that's because in my family that word wouldn't have been used, and it certainly has a moral, religious tone to it. So I think in Catholicism, guilt, sin and guilt, and good and evil, that kind of thing, is very prominent. Rather than feel guilty, if I do something wrong, I usually see that and I understand that I did something wrong. And if it's in relationship to other people, then I apologise and say I'm sorry. And it's more or less, because it's quite shallow, quite petty, you just a simple remark can clear things away. Of course, the deeper you do something that's damaging, the more you might internalise that as a kind of guilt. But it's interesting how things like authority and fear and power and influence, how they become internalized, and how really the conscious mind has very little control over that kind of conditioning. I mean, all of those instincts and levels of conformity and behaviour that are really built up throughout childhood, how they are very subconscious reactions, and throughout the day any one of them could be triggered. Like, we're very susceptible to the world around us. And of course, one of the primary responses to all of this is insecurity. I think when you get to the level of a kind of primal feeling of insecurity, you then get frightened within that insecurity, and that's a very internal, very deep-seated reaction that most of us try to avoid. So we know what to do in order not to feel insecure and frightened. So in a sense we fall to pieces. We lose our ground, as it were. So we build up a ground of security and identity with that, and certain things can penetrate that. I remember when I was in university and I did quite well, but I decided to leave before I got my degree. But I didn't feel insecure, I didn't feel psychological at all about it. It was just simply that I didn't want to do it, and I didn't do it. And I just carried on my life, and that's when I had a breakthrough experience, a spiritual experience, which I couldn't have predicted at all, because I knew nothing about spirituality, and I knew nothing about the deep level that opened up within me, as it were. But when it did open up, there was a deep sense of insecurity, because the identification of being a student, for example, although that was temporary, there was also obviously from the past a kind of inner sense of security I felt in myself, quite independent. I felt confident in myself. I didn't measure myself against other people. I wasn't afraid of authority. So I was a pretty ordinary person that just felt very secure and independent within myself. But this level opened up a kind of chasm, a kind of psychotic interlude, as I call it, and this kind of fear and insecurity was quite powerful. I mean, it overwhelmed me. So I thought I was, I didn't know what the disturbance was, because I'd never accessed that deeper level. And I thought there was something wrong with my body or something, my brain. Anyway, I got through that over a number of weeks, lived with it, and then I felt very liberated. I felt enlightened and self-aware, and that was later found to be an initiation process. So without me knowing anything about it, I went through an initiation process, Um, and from that time I felt independent again, liberated, secure, confident, with a sense of freedom. Now, I asked myself, why didn't I remain satisfied with that condition, with that state? You know, I could have said to people, I've experienced initiation, enlightenment, and that was good enough. But once I read the spiritual text and found out what that was, then that wasn't really, that was one level of understanding, and there was another aspect to the one mind which was transcendental. So I experienced an embodied sense of the one mind and not the transcendental. So I suppose what happened was, although my first experience gave me a new ground of being, that ground became insubstantial, became, you might say, inadequate unless I had connected with the transcendental level. This is the kind of psychology or the thinking within the sacred texts. I mean, at the moment, I don't really think much about the transcendent, because there's nothing I can do about it. When the mind comes into your life, it comes in spontaneously. I didn't know it existed, and then it came into my life. Therefore, I knew it existed as a fact. But I don't know that the transcendent is a fact, even though there are reliable sources in the sacred tradition. But nonetheless, until you actually experience it, you can't say it's an objective fact. And although you might say that objective experience implies something that might happen in the future, I don't think in terms of working anything out or preparing or doing anything about it. So although I can't actually forget the fact that there might be something in the future, I don't actually internalize that, so I'm actually worried or concerned about it. But if I sit here now and I'm aware of the mind in the world in a you might say embodied sense, I do feel that there is a kind of reaching out or a search, not a search in the sense that I'm doing anything, I'm not working with a process, I'm not working analytically, I'm not working through anything through my thinking. It's a kind of looking with the mind, as it were, but also with my consciousness, and it's in my consciousness, there's a sense of being perplexed. There's a sense of not knowing quite what to do with my thinking, what to do with my consciousness. Now that I've stopped writing and researching, what do I do to fill my time, as it were? Because the transcendental experience in the future may never happen. So what am I going to do for the number of years ahead of me? And I don't know. I don't actually know. Even in terms of lifestyle, I don't know what my lifestyle will be. I'm not sure whether I'll be talking to other people about my work. And if I didn't get involved with my work with other people, then what would I do? And the sense is that I don't know. And in that sense of I don't know, or I can't say, as it were, there's a sensation in my body that's been here today, all day. It's something that I believe relates to my childhood, where I feel slightly sick. It's a kind of nausea or vertigo that affects my head and my stomach. It's only mild, but it's enough to make me feel slightly off balance, slightly confused. Not confused in my thinking, but confused in my feeling. It's more in the nervous system. And that's like permanent, it's been there all day. And as I say, things could trigger that off through childhood and all through my life. Things can trigger that feeling. So if somebody gets confused in their life, what decisions to make and what to do about the future, etc. We often think they're confused about making a decision or thinking things through, or there's some idea or some image or something about their life. But for me, it's more on as I say, a feeling level. It's almost like my feeling level isn't integrated. It's almost as if the feeling level and the nervous system and the emotions are kind of mixed up. Whereas I think of feeling as being more balanced and orderly, the emotions and the nervous system, which are much more physical, much more instinctive, whereas feelings, I would say, are more to do with your consciousness. So I think that goes back to a very early time in childhood. I mean, it might even be prenatal. I don't actually know. But it's interesting that right now, as I'm talking about authority, about insecurity, it's very apt, it's very relevant to how I'm actually feeling in my life about the rest of the day and tomorrow and the next day. It's very interesting because I can't imagine not having this kind of sick feeling. It's almost as if, to be honest, it's like an inner disturbance that probably originates in my childhood and means that something in my life has made me feel insecure, possibly insecure or uncertain, or something disturbing me, and I never dealt with it. I couldn't deal with it as a child, and nothing in my life seems to have address that level, and maybe at some subtle level I avoid that level because it is disturbing, and when you're experiencing it, it's slightly desperate and slightly urgent, but I'm not in a state of how can I say, it's not a problem, it's just a fact of my behaviour, it's a fact of my constitution, it's not a problem. It's not a problem that I analyse, it's not a problem that has a beginning and an end. It's something you live with, and you see the correlation, as I say, in my childhood, and something that's always been there, as it were. And it's not something I particularly want to share with anybody else, or go to the doctor or therapist or anything like that. It's something I can't consciously think about in terms of integrating it. It's so instinctive, it's so built in at a deep level that it's like being out at sea, because you can get seasick. So imagine being out at sea in a boat and you're feeling a bit seasick and you don't know when you're going to stop, when it's going to become calm. It's a bit rough at sea, and it's a bit like that. Maybe later on today, tomorrow, it will subside, and then I'll forget about it and feel relatively all right. But the fact that it's there, the fact that I can't deal with it as I'm experiencing it now, is kind of puzzling to me. It's puzzling to me why I can't deal with it, why I can't integrate this level of insecurity, you might say. But I don't feel the insecurity is a problem, so it's not something I'm worried about. It's just, again, it's just something within your body, within your psyche, your makeup, or your conditioning, that is it's so ordinary. It's not a big deal as such, but it's a big deal in the sense that it seems to be connected to something else, let's put it that way. It's almost as if it is connected to something else which I'm not aware of, and that's why I say I haven't integrated it. So, as I say, if you think of the more subconscious level of emotions and instincts and fear and insecurity, that kind of basic level, and then say the integration would mean the feeling is more whole, so you can feel things as a whole, whereas you could say the emotions and nervous system is much more fragmented, much more confusing. So if I said I feel good, then that's quite clear. Now if I said I didn't feel good, then probably it would be more of a sense of uncertainty, confusion, things aren't working well, and there's a disturbance. So I would say that goes to the level of emotions and nervous system. So at the moment, what I'm looking at right now is if there is something that might be connected to this vertigo, then I'm really trying to imagine it. I mean, Jung says that something that remains unconscious and not integrated needs to be amplified. And by that, he means, you know, if you sat down and did a painting, when you're feeling something or experiencing something, then that manifestation of a painting or that image will begin to free you, will begin to crystallize and create a kind of order and balance on the more conscious level, in consciousness. So you're kind of, in a sense, you're elevating or bringing out of the unconscious or subconscious something conscious. And as I'm actually saying this, I can feel a certain easing off of this not insecurity, but vertigo. It's almost like calming down, slightly calming down. And of course, when we get into an inner crisis like this, you know, kind of psychosis or nervous disorder, neurosis, etc., when you get down to the level of an inner crisis, this is where you understand things like religion, where you have Christ or God will come in to help you when you're in distress. So you can see very clearly the relationship between this kind of inner disturbance, crisis or insecurity that life brings you. You know, people in a war and they're refugees, or they've got to face an illness in the family, or a crisis in losing their work, that kind of thing. And people turn to religion, or they turn to mediums because they want information about their future prospects. See, I can't, out of this condition, I can't think of an idea of God in the sense of, I can't think of, say, the transcendental wisdom or the spiritual dimension, which is equivalent to God, as it were. I can't think of that in any way that affects my consciousness. So it's no good me thinking about that as if that's going to do anything to me, because it won't. Because I have no image of it, and I don't even know if it exists. So I don't believe in it like people believe in God and pray to God. I don't believe in anything in my future. I don't believe in what the sacred texts say, other than I want to experience whatever they say as a fact. And until I experience it as a fact, I'm not going to indulge in belief. And also in this state, I can think of a particular person that I know that can relieve this level when I'm in conversation. But only when I'm in conversation, then I feel it's alleviated. Or I think of something positive happening. So if something very positive happened, I think that would shift the energy level so that, yeah, I would be shifted out of the more subconscious to the more conscious. So from an insecure level to the security of feeling that something good's happened. So it's all this kind of, you know, the psychology of how conscious and unconscious and subconscious work, and how levels of security, insecurity work, and authority and fear and guilt. And I'm talking about what's going on in each person across the world, and how the whole of society and history, we're all involved in this drama, because it really is a drama, and we're all trying to act our part. So I'm trying to act the part of a spiritual person, and my friend is acting the part as a professor, that kind of thing. So as long as I'm interested in the transcendent, then I'm a spiritual person acting on the world stage, as it were, in my life, in order to fulfill my destiny, as it were. To complete the process. So if you're a scientist and you're studying the quantum field, you want to make the next step to complete this process, and you can move on to another process. So 50 years ago I began the spiritual process, and now 50 years later I want to finish the spiritual process. But just as at the beginning, you can't control the mind, either it comes into your life or it doesn't. In the same way, I can't control my future, because the mind will come in of its own accord. You can't make it happen. There's no practice of meditation or anything like that. In the sense of authority in society, it's predicated on the idea of a hierarchy where those at the top are supposed to know what they're doing. So we put our trust in politicians and religious people and people in universities and people that run the business and everything. We put our trust in that authority, and often we're let down by that authority. So I suppose I have put my trust in the sacred texts. Although, as I say, I do base my own spiritual life on my own experiences. But when you're contemplating a further step that you haven't experienced, the next step, as it were, then by implication, psychologically, there must be some trace of dependency and attachment to the idea that it will happen in the future, or it could happen. Going through a difficult time or challenging time or disturbing time or crisis or something like that, my attitude is quite pragmatic. I just feel, I just live through it. That's how I've always been, I think, all my life. I'm quite realistic. And I'm not idealistic in that I prefer not to believe in anything. I prefer not to trust an authority. And also when you live through something, in a sense you feel more organic, you feel more wholesome, because you're living through it as a whole. And what happens is when you meet a disturbance, which may have been there from childhood, then in a sense you know you're not whole. It's pointing out the fact that you're not whole. In the same way, the transcendental level is pointing out that I'm not really liberated. Or that I don't know the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? Or what happens after death, for example. So in a sense, I'm not anymore asking questions, so therefore I don't want an answer. And that's why probably I'm experiencing my life more on a feeling level, because the thinking level is not really relevant to the way I'm looking at life at the moment. And also, I'm not really interested in the kind of intuitive level. I'm not trying to intuit anything. I know there was a period where, I think it was in my 30s, 40s, where I remember people would say, how are you feeling, you know? They'd just come up to you and say, how are you feeling? And I remember reflecting on that and actually thinking that I don't actually know how I'm feeling. And I did find that quite difficult, you know, in the sense of, what was I feeling? What was I feeling like? And so it was more like, are you feeling good or are you feeling bad? Or are you feeling all right? And I just couldn't work out. I didn't know what to say. So even though I can give a symptom to how I'm feeling, like vertigo, I don't really know what that is. I have no idea what that actually is. So I can't even give a condition, I can't give a thought, I can't give a context, I can't give a background. I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure it's been there all my life. Just like the fear, I mean, I've had fear in my childhood, not serious fear, but I had a fear, and I can have a fear as an adult, which is exactly the same. It's almost like the feeling of the fear is identical. So there's a point of being insecure, so some level of feeling insecure. So I would say the feeling as a child of being insecure, the fear, wasn't on the outside, it was more on the inside, to do with my experience of a feeling of leaving my body, what they call an out-of-the-body experience, a sense of leaving my body. And that's always been a problem, so I've never actually had an out-of-the-body. There's this feeling of letting go of my consciousness. Or you might say, you're letting go of your identity. So I don't know, again, if that is a kind of amplification, if that is actually relevant to how I'm feeling now. Is it maybe an anticipation of some level that might prefigure a kind of letting go in terms of leaving your body and going into transcendence? Of course, this is very sketchy. I can't give a clear diagram, as it were. Because if I think now of what would be a solution to this problem, and I'm saying problem in a very ordinary sense, I don't mean it is a problem that I'm concerned with that deeply, but if I think what is a solution, I really couldn't imagine. You know, if I thought I could just take some simple medication from the chemist and it would just make me feel better, you know, take away the nausea. I know that is, although it could be taken away to a degree, I know that really that medication is irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with anything. If I went to the doctor and they said something, or a psychologist or therapist, and they were talking, I just feel that they can't possibly know, because it's too personal. It's too elusive. You know, although psychoanalysis is supposed to go back to your childhood and, you know, unearth and reveal things from your childhood, I just feel somehow that whatever the analyst said would just be putting layers and layers and layers of meaning on top of it. But I feel I'm alone with the way I am. I feel that there's something very private that is going on, which can be talked about in medical books, as it were, just like actually in religious and spiritual books. You can read about things, but the actual experience is very, very different from what you read about. I mean, when you're experiencing deep insecurity and a kind of psychosis in the sense of the void, of going into the void, which was my first experience, there's no way that reading the books could ever prepare you for that shock, that traumatic shock. So I tend to want to go through things organically for myself, because that is where I believe the transformation, the real transformation, takes place. So you might say you have to go through the crisis yourself. I mean, if you have a fever, the doctor can attend to you, but in the actuality of going through the kind of, you might say, culmination of the fever, you may go into a kind of unconscious state or feverish state, and you are on your own. You're absolutely on your own. No, so I'm not looking for a cure, and I don't think the idea of religious authority of any kind, within the institution or within the belief or ideal of God or anything like that, or any medical profession and psychiatry and all of that. I mean, I don't want anyone to cure me. There's something that I find attractive and fascinating in being alone with things as they are, the reality of being alone with things as they are. You see, if you think of, say, you get information about conflict going on, say in the Middle East, a war zone. And of course, people have all these fantasies about being in a war zone. And psychologically, pretty much nobody wants to be in a war zone. And, maybe people coming out of a war zone will tell their story. But I wonder if there's a way of living as a human being in the human condition. That means within the world as it is, within the world as it's always been for the human species. That means if you think of a spectrum of conditions, from good to bad, from illness to well-being, if you think of the whole psychology and emotions and everything of the human condition, and you think of all the conditioning in society that says this is bad, this is good, and you've got to get help from religion, you've got to get help from your parents, you've got to get help. Well, I remember that first experience as a child at 4 years old, this thing of an out-of-the-body kind of experience. I was a bit frightened, but I don't think I ever told my parents. And pretty much very few people know about anything in my life. About my past, about my history, my spiritual experiences, my psychology, or anything like that. Very few people. I mean, really, in effect, only one person, that's my friend, knows some pretty, not all of it, but knows quite a lot of my life. But I'm really, I'm bringing it all out in these videos, but I just feel life is very personal. The root of it, the actual living of it, I mean, I do feel alone, and I like being alone, and I like looking at the crisis, facing the crisis, and there's something very real about that. It brings you alive. It's your life, and this is life. There are war zones, and there are tornadoes, and there are tsunamis, and there are emotional crises and conflicts. And instead of having this idea that they shouldn't exist, as some people believe, like a lot of spiritual teachers believe, and that finding a problem or a cause of conflict, a cause of what goes on inside you and outside of you, all this stuff that religion and politics and medicine, all the institutions in society, basically speaking, I don't filter my life through them. I don't filter my consciousness and my experience through them. So I've been alone a lot in very deep levels of disturbance and very deep levels of insecurity. And I would prefer to live through that. I don't know why. It's not because I have a particular opinion about authority or any institution. I'm not antagonistic against society or science, and I'm not idealistic about nature and alternative medicine and all these things. No, as a human being, I like to live a real life. No, living a real life is going through what's really happening. And it's not about spirituality, it's not about psychology, it's about myself living my life. As you say, authority is related to authenticity. Authenticity is related to being an author, and that's related to autobiography. That means writing your own story, authenticating your own experience, living your own life, being true to yourself. And that's absolutely my philosophy of life. So in a way, if you say, what's my relationship to other people, in the sense of what we're talking about now, in the sense of, do I have an answer? Do I have a cure? Psychologically, spiritually, in any way? No, I don't. I mean, my friend was here recently, and he's happy within his family, he's in his 50s, he's a very successful writer, professor, a world scholar, lovely family, nice house, everything, really good. But he's having a kind of breakdown under pressure because of the stress of his life. So although he's happy in one way, and everything's working out perfectly well, on another level, organically, something in him's not coping, and he's having a kind of breakdown psychophysically. And that's the first time I've ever seen him like that. Because I've known him for 32 years, and he's been a very peaceful person, very well adapted, organically healthy in every way. Really model person, really a person I respect. And to see this person, quite in anguish, almost in anguish, and I felt there was absolutely nothing I could do. And the same was with my mother, who was a very tragic figure in her later years, and I just felt helpless. I didn't know what to do. Now, spiritually, in the past, I have been told that I could be a healer and a medium, and I've spent time with healers and stuff like that. But I've never practiced anything. I would not take on the role of a healer. I would not play that part, any psychic stuff. And I think, again, it's because I don't want to filter between myself and my friend. I don't want to take on the role of anything. I just want to be myself. And if something happens between us as friends, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I don't want to be somebody I'm not, or be playing a part, because all of these psychic abilities, really you're playing a part. And my view is there's something deeper and profounder than being psychic. healing somebody, you could say, oh, I'm healing, it must be good. But I question whether that is organically whole, whether it's actually wholesome to heal someone. I'm not saying you shouldn't heal someone, but I'm talking about how I look at life. That I think there's something deeper about the spiritual, holistic way of looking, which is the one mind. The one mind is freedom, and freedom means that you're not dependent on anything, physically, psychically, socially, politically, religiously. There's a kind of profound independence, and you're not in your consciousness, you're not a personality putting on a persona, however noble, however beneficent, however helpful. But as I say, if I do have psychic abilities and they function spontaneously within the whole of my being when I'm with my friend, so be it. But I don't want to monitor anything. I don't want to know that. I don't want to see my friend in the light of what I'm doing for him and what I'm not doing for him. You know, I relate to him as a whole, and he does the same to me. So I think that is the way for me to be. The one is the one, and the one does what the one does. So self in the one, call it Buddhahood, call it transcendental wisdom, or the body of wisdom, or the diamond body, nirvana, and enlightenment, all those terms really mean that the one, the mind as it were, does what it does. And it came into my life spontaneously, and I think it works creatively and spontaneously, holistically, and in a way you could say doesn't leave a trace. It can't be identified other than emptiness. So I'm pretty sure the one is doing something in my life, in the world, and objectively the one in transcendence is doing something possibly to the whole planet and the universe, and who knows what the boundaries are, because if the one is emptiness, then there are no boundaries. It's eternal. So I can't make an absolute statement about the transcendental one, but I think from my own experience of the one in the embodied sense, I think that the one works on oneself and the world and other people holistically. So that's where I am at the moment. Leaving things open, and I'll be seeing my friend again, see how he is when he comes. But I don't feel protective, I feel that he's living his real life, and I may play a part, I may not, in factors of what's disturbing him. Yeah, just leave it open. Leave things in freedom, as it were.